The folly of pride is examined in many ways. The story focuses on two people, Mr. Darcy and Miss Elizabeth Bennet. Both are a part of what is known at the time as the gentleman's class, or that strata of society whose wealth allows them not to be engaged in daily work. Yet, these two people of privilege have very differing social and economic backgrounds. Miss Bennet comes from a rural society where there is little influence of influential social connections. And her family is kind of at that lower end of the economic ladder within her own strata. Mr. Darcy, on the other hand, comes from a family of high social connections and financial standing. What we would call that 1%er class of people. Those of Miss Bennet's circle would benefit because of their lower situation in society by rubbing shoulders with that circle that Mr. Darcy runs around in. Whereas, at the same time, Mr. Darcy would be seen as condescending of his own stature in life to associate in the circle that Miss Bennet runs around in. Now, of course, these two people were destined to fall in love. And at one point, Mr. Darcy expresses his undying love and devotion to Miss Bennet. Unfortunately, for Mr. Darcy, his admission to love was done with language that was less than complimentary to Miss Bennet's family and social standing. You see, Mr. Darcy shared his true feelings towards Miss Bennet. He just poured out his heart. And he shared the risks of public ridicule toward him and his family by his marrying Miss Bennet. But that he was willing to endure that indignity and those conversations of ridicule because of the love that he had towards her. Now, can't you just imagine how Miss Bennet was able to fully embrace this kind of a proposal? Not at all. But for those of you who believe in true love, fear not, for the story does end with a happy conclusion. The story climaxes with Mr. Darcy privately saving the day for the Bennet family. Mr. Darcy had realized that the potential disaster that was awaiting the Bennet family was actually caused because of his own pride. So by humbling himself and saving the Bennet family from scandal and public ridicule, he was able to heal those wounds and build a bridge over the barrier that had been built between he and Miss Bennet. And he and Elizabeth were married and presumably lived happily ever after. Pride comes in many forms. This morning's reading about the commander named Naaman is very much a lesson about pride and how it too can affect many lives adversely. Yet this story isn't solely about the pride of individuals, but a story of how we see God working through the most unlikely people. Today's story reminds us that God is not a God of just some, but of all people. No matter what tribe you come from, no matter how rich or poor you might be, even when you do not recognize God as your God, God extends a place at the table to everyone. Enter the great commander of the Armenian army, Naaman, a non-Hebrew and a person who did not know the God of the Hebrews. Naaman was a good man, a good soldier, and of high social rank, and he had much to base his pride on. Yet Naaman, in all of his greatness, is described to us as having an incurable disease of leprosy, a disease that literally ostracizes you from community, and especially in a time when disease was looked upon as a punishment by God. The irony of this morning's story is that often it is the people of low social and economic standing that perceive God's work, while those in high social and economic standing may not. Naaman, who seemed to be a humble man on the surface as he was listening to the lowly servant girl's suggestion to go to Israel and to seek out that prophet Elijah, who through the power of God could heal him. But Naaman goes not to the prophet Elijah directly. No, he stays in his social class. He goes to the king of Israel. Amazingly enough, the king of Israel isn't even aware of the prophet Elijah or his powers. So when Naaman does go to Elijah, Naaman's pride is hurt because Elijah does not come out directly and to greet Naaman. Nor does Elijah put on this big show in order to heal Naaman. How often have we been disappointed when seeking God's attention, when it comes in a way that we have not perceived it to come to us? We're no different than Naaman. Feeling unrespected of his position, Naaman storms off in anger. Yet again, through the voice of a lowly servant, he puts his pride aside and follows those simple instructions of bathing 7 times in the river Jordan. In his action of humility, Naaman becomes healed. Immediately he goes back to Elijah and he wants to pay for this healing. Elijah declines the payment, saying that God's grace is not for sale, but that it comes as a gift. And here is a point, and here is an important point of this particular story. Naaman, through his experience of healing, then develops a faith in God, not the other way around. He doesn't have faith in God and then seek healing. He's healed. And out of that healing, he develops that faith in God. So often the mantra of religion says that you must first accept the creeds, that you first buy into the rules before you can receive healing, receive salvation. That's not what this story tells us. That would make God our puppet. That is the pride within us. And it is what keeps us from finding the healing that we so often ask of God. How often do we let pride hinder us from healing? Pride as an individual, pride as a nation, pride as a religious person. Of course, we have been taught through the book of Proverbs that pride precedes a fall. But how do we recognize when our pride is getting in the way of our healing? How do we recognize when our self-importance is getting in our way of being healed? How do our attachments to physical things stand in our way of moving forward in life? I often wonder if pride isn't any more than a wall that we use to protect ourselves from what life can throw at us. A wall that shields us from uncertainty that comes with change. Pride can provide a nice roadmap of what orderliness in life should look like for us, and helps us deflect those things that disturb our order. Things like challenges of cultural behaviors that are unlike our own, of having to alter our surroundings in order to make room for someone with physical disabilities, of how I learn to interact with a person who suffers with mental illness, or becoming open enough to learn about a wide range of human sexuality, of making room for those who follow God differently than the way I do. Healing comes to many people when we allow ourselves the freedom to just love and to accept one another in all of the situations of life's journey. The opening greeting that is said here each week is not a hollow set of words. It is an act of healing. Think upon the meaning of these words. No matter who you are welcome here in this sacred space. Imagine the healing power within those words to the person who is in need of finding a home, in the need of feeling accepted, in the need of community. This, my friends, is the very definition of salvation. We who are here in this space are the foundation of God's salvation. Let us not just greet one another in God's love, but cultivate an environment where our pride can be dismantled enough to allow a healing, a salvation to all who come seeking